United States Navy Captain Daniel Gallery had already made a name for himself by disrupting German U-boat operations across the Atlantic. But by the summer of 1944, he was preparing for the boldest gamble of his career. An operation no one had dared attempt in more than a century and lived to tell the tale. As their latest prey, U-505 broke the surface after a devastating depth charge assault. Water cascaded off her hull, and smoke billowed from her battered frame. Despite the damage, the submarine was suddenly under a relentless barrage of fire from American destroyers and aircraft. Desperate to escape, the German crew scrambled to abandon ship, diving into the Atlantic as gunfire rained all around them. For the Americans, the goal was clear. A hand-picked boarding team prepared to brave toxic fumes, flooding, and the looming threat of scuttling charges and booby-traps. They were about to venture where no American had gone before, into the very heart of an enemy submarine. Trials at sea. In December 1943, German U-boat 505 was leaderless, her crew demoralized, and her luck seemingly spent. Among the hundreds of Kriegsmarine submarines, she was infamous for her knack of attracting disaster. However, it didn't start this way. During her very first patrol a year before, the Type 9C submarine sank a 7,200-ton British freighter, marking a strong debut. But this early promise then gave way to repeated failures, missed torpedo shots, harrowing depth charge attacks, and more, each mission more disastrous than the last. Suffering damage from aircraft and warships alike, limping back to port time and again, U-505 underwent extended repairs that kept her out of action for months. But the low point came in October 1943, when Allied warships depth-charged U-505 near the Caribbean. As the chaos unfolded, with explosions rocking the vessel back and forth and morale shattered beyond belief, the defeated skipper, Captain Peter Zech, unfortunately took his own life in the middle of the attack. Now it seemed as if the submarine was cursed. But High Command intended to change this, and following the tragic incident, 40-year-old Oberlieutenant Harold Long took command of U-505. At the time, leadership hoped that Long's age and steady demeanor would help stabilize the shaken crew. Long's first major patrol didn't come until 3 months later, when on March 16, 1944, U-505 set out to hunt Allied shipping off the western coast of Africa. For endless days, she patrolled the waters off Senegal, past the shores of Sierra Leone, and into the Gulf of Guinea, searching for Allied shipping. In hot pursuit. Skipper Long was no stranger to the U-boat strategy. He knew ships like U-505 excelled on the surface, where they could outrun most convoys, cruising at more than 20 knots. By day, she stayed concealed, waiting for the cover of night to rise and reposition for the win. Most commanders played it safe, executing end runs from just beyond the horizon, where they could stalk their targets undetected. But the boldest captains, those willing to risk everything, slipped into the convoy's formation. Once there, with bow and stern torpedoes at the ready, they would strike from within, sowing chaos in every direction. A daring tactic Long was prepared to embrace. And yet, despite weeks at sea, the submarine didn't encounter a single vessel. One of the crewmen remarked, quote, "The Hex is still with us." Unbeknownst to the Germans, this time their ship's failure had little to do with bad luck, as Allied naval intelligence had intercepted the sub's radio transmissions and rerouted all shipping away from her to ensure she returned to port empty-handed. At the end of May, Long decided to return to Lorient, a U-boat base on the western coast of France. Their boat was low on fuel. Worst of all, the crew was frustrated and in low spirits. Nothing was accomplished in nearly 2.5 months. What they didn't know was that Allied codebreakers were tracking her every move. Knowing the U-boat's destination and the route she was likely to take, this crucial intelligence reached the hands of Captain Daniel Gallery. Now, the German U-boat U-505 was heading straight into the grasp of the United States Navy's Task Group 22-3. Just one chance. Task Group 22-3's trip began on May 15, 1944, when it departed Norfolk, Virginia. This anti-submarine hunter-killer team was centered around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, part of the Casablanca class. Rounding out the group were 5 destroyer escorts: USS Chatelaine, USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, and USS Jinx, all under orders to scour the Atlantic Ocean to hunt and attack enemy submarines. At the helm of Task Group 22-3 was Navy Captain Daniel Gallery, a Chicago native and former aviator. Commanding a jeep carrier like Guadalcanal in the South Atlantic wasn't the most prestigious assignment, and Gallery knew it. These smaller ships, often called baby carriers, were seen as inferior to the Navy's fleet carriers. Some even dismissed them as second class. Gallery was fully aware of the reputation these vessels carried, and how difficult it would be to distinguish himself and his men in such a role. Yet, knowing this could be his only chance to lead a task group in combat, the 42-year-old commander was determined to make it count. By mid-1944, Dan Gallery's task group set sail from the Canary Islands for Cape Verde, armed with critical intelligence from intercepted German communications. Though the Allies hadn't cracked the exact coordinates of U-boat positions, encrypted with a newer Enigma device, they had enough information to focus on key operational zones. This, plus the use of HFDF, or Huff Duff, a direction-finding system that triangulated U-boat radio transmissions, Gallery's group wasn't patrolling aimlessly. Guided by cutting-edge technology and strategy, they closed in on their target. Submarines relied on radio transmissions to share positions, resupply needs, and convoy sightings. But these signals were also their weakness. Task Group 22-3 would slip into targeted shipping lanes, spreading out to intercept transmissions. Then, with 2 ships triangulating the signal, they could pinpoint a U-boat's position. Now, armed with depth charges, hedgehogs, advanced sonar, and countless rounds of ammunition, Task Group 22-3 was turning targets into results. Eureka moment. In early April, Task Group 22-3, after hours of relentless pursuit and depth charge attacks against U-515, the submarine was forced to surface, and her crew had no choice but to abandon the ship. Gallery's escorts moved rapidly to rescue the German sailors as their damaged ship began her slow descent into the ocean. Watching the scene unfold, Gallery had a realization. He recalled, quote, "Suppose we hadn't been so bloody-minded about sinking her." Just then, it hit him. With the right training and preparation, the task group could board the submarine, stop the scuttling process, and seize the U-boat as a living war prize. Unbeknownst to him, the United States Navy hadn't captured an enemy vessel on the high seas for more than 130 years, when during the War of 1812, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry seized several British ships during the Battle of Lake Erie. Earlier in World War II, the Royal Navy and U.S. Navy had succeeded only twice in boarding scuttled German U-boats, in the process recovering the coveted Enigma machines that gave the Allies their crucial advantage. Gallery knew that if he could pull off a similar feat, capturing a German submarine intact, complete with the latest Enigma coding machines, this could be his chance to showcase the potential of jeep carriers and prove what bold leadership could achieve. Less than 12 hours after this epiphany, Task Group 22-3 spotted U-68 near Cape Verde and launched another coordinated attack, destroying the submarine with aerial bombs. After this victory, Gallery shared his bold new plan with his men. If a U-boat surfaced, instead of sinking her outright, the destroyer escorts would suppress her deck guns with 50 caliber machine guns, and, as the leader put it, quote, encourage them to get the hell off that U-boat. Once the crew abandoned the U-boat, a special boarding party would storm the submarine, disarm traps, close scuttling valves, and stabilize her to keep her afloat, ultimately towing her back to the land of the free. As Gallery shared his vision, skepticism was clear on the faces of the destroyer escort captains. Despite the odds, he began to train a boarding party within his task group and equip them with all the skills needed to secure the U-boat. Drawing on intelligence from captured German sailors, he drilled his team tirelessly. Soon, they would find the perfect prey. Gallery felt it in his bones. The hunt begins. For the rest of the spring, Captain Gallery rehearsed the bold operation in his mind. The sole idea seemed almost fantastical, yet he was determined to see it through. Task Group 22-3 carried on prowling the waters off the west coast of Africa, scouring the Atlantic for elusive German U-boats. By early summer, the task group had yet to make contact with any enemy submarines. The Germans were out there, but with dwindling fuel reserves, the task force had no choice but to chart a course back to Casablanca for refueling. Then, on June 4th, 1944, luck smiled on the captain. As USS Guadalcanal and her escorts began their return journey, a fighter plane launched for reconnaissance duty. The water of the Rio de Oro sparkled crystal clear under the African sun as the FM-2 Wildcat fighter swept through the area, when the pilot's sharp stare caught sight of a silhouette moving below. It was U-505. The German submarine, battered and fatigued from their fruitless war patrol, had inadvertently wandered into the hunting grounds of Task Group 22-3. The fighter pilot immediately relayed the coordinates back to the task force, maintaining visual contact with the vessel. Captain Gallery wasted no time. With adrenaline surging, he ordered the destroyer escorts to close in on the target. As the formation surged toward U-505, her metal hull glinted in the shimmering blue of the Atlantic. Realizing the danger, Oberlieutenant Harold Long, commanding the submarine, gave the order to fire before the enemy could get any closer. A torpedo streaked through the water, aimed at USS Guadalcanal. Destroyer escorts maneuvered frantically, narrowly avoiding disaster as the weapon passed beneath USS Chatelaine. The Germans had made it clear they wouldn't go down without a fight. Seizing the opportunity, Chatelaine moved aggressively, closing in on U-505. At such close range, conventional depth charges were useless. They couldn't descend quickly enough to strike. Instead, the crew fired a series of Mark IV Hedgehog mortars, small, contact-detonated explosives designed to disable rather than destroy, exactly what the mission demanded. Above the fray, the Wildcat circled, its pilot keeping a vigilant eye on the action. Spotting the submarine's position through the motion, the aircraft fired into the water to mark U-505's location. Guided by aerial assistance, Chatelaine launched a pattern of depth charges, leading to underwater explosions that blurred everything for a moment. Then, a dark stain began to spread across the ocean's surface. Over the radio, the fighter pilots confirmed what the crew on board was hoping for. Quote, "You struck oil, Frenchie." Chaos on board. Underwater, the Germans aboard the U-boat witnessed the destruction of their vessel. Their desperate attempt to dodge USS Chatelaine strikes proved meaningless, with sailors being thrown to the ground as the vessel absorbed each hit. The curse of U-505 had returned with a vengeance. The crew scrambled to their positions, gripping railings and consoles as they struggled to stay upright against the violent jolts. Sailors rushed through the cramped steel corridors, fighting to stabilize the U-boat. The possibility of mounting a counteroffensive was no longer an option. Survival was now the only goal. Yet, with each deafening burst within the vessel, hopes for this dimmed as well. In the control room, systems failed one by one. Salt water poured in through ruptured steams, flooding compartments and short-circuiting critical equipment. The submarine's rudder was jammed, leaving her helplessly circling in the water, turning her into a stationary target for her pursuers. The situation at the engine room was no better, with crew members standing frozen as they watched a crack snake along the pressure hull. The sight of swirling oil and debris escaping from the submarine betrayed their coordinates to the American forces above. Recognizing neither fight nor escape was viable, Captain Long was forced to make an impossible decision. He ordered the submarine to surface and be abandoned, saving his crew from ending their service in the depths of the ocean. His troops raced to follow the scuttling procedures in an attempt to deprive the Americans of the coveted prize they were after. As soon as U-505 broke through the surface, American destroyer escorts and aircraft met their enemies with 20 and 40mm rounds on the submarine's exposed deck as the sailors assumed their escape positions. One by one, the Germans began to leap into the water, many dodging ricochets and stray bullets as they abandoned the doomed submarine. Some faltered at the edge of the deck, others were struck by fire, collapsing before being pushed overboard by the chaos around them. Long himself was hit in the legs, the force of the gunfire throwing him back into the hatch before he managed to drag himself out. In the water, wounded sailors clung to floating debris, desperate to stay afloat in the oil-stained sea. For a moment, they were certain the American attack would continue, wiping the crew of U-505 entirely. But to the enemy's surprise, the destroyer escorts began fishing the Germans from the water, pulling 59 sailors aboard. Soaked, injured, and completely defeated, the men were stripped of their weapons, becoming prisoners of war. Many hesitated to step into an enemy ship, but it was a better fate than drowning in the Atlantic. As the sailors sat on the deck of Chatelaine, they turned back to see that, to their horror, U-505 remained afloat. In their rush to abandon the ship, the scuttling charges meant to destroy the submarine had not been activated, leaving a clear path for the Americans to claim the vessel. Prepare boarding parties. The German crew could only watch as their enemies readied to board the bruised submarine. Gallery's time had come, and what had appeared an impossible feat for much of the war now was within reach for Task Group 22-3. The captain looked at his men and declared, quote, "I want to capture that bastard, if possible." Gallery's meticulously rehearsed operations began to unfold, just as he had envisioned during months of preparation. He issued the command. USS Pillsbury would deploy the boarding party. Ever since the U-boat hunting efforts began, they had pored over a blueprint of German underwater vessels provided by intelligence, memorizing every crucial valve, hatch, and mechanism that could keep a captured submarine afloat. Lieutenant Albert L. David was the team leader, directing the sailors dressed in combat gear as they assumed their positions aboard Pillsbury. They knew the risks. Scuttling charges could finish sinking the submarine any instant, and booby-traps might be waiting for them in every corner. But the bounty was well worth the risk. Inside U-505 lay treasures that could turn the tide of the war. Codebooks, navigational charts, and most precious of all, the Enigma machine. Pillsbury's crew launched a small craft into the rolling waves, braving violent waters as the boarding party steered toward the U-boat. As they drew nearer, they could see the conning tower and forward deck jutted from the water at a precarious angle, while steam hissed from her damaged interior. U-505's erratic movements created an additional challenge, threatening to tip the small boarding craft as she sidled alongside. The sailors gripped the edges of the craft tightly, steering themselves against the aggressive rocking. Lieutenant David was the first to climb onto the submarine's slick conning tower. One by one, his men followed, their boots pressing firmly against the oil-coated deck to prevent them from slipping away. Uncharted territory. Inside U-505, the American boarding party stepped into the chaotic scene the Germans had fled from just moments ago. The damage from the depth charge inflicted by their own task group was devastating. Lieutenant Albert David and his team quickly realized the water was flooding the U-505 at an alarming rate, as the Germans had succeeded in opening several critical valves during their escape, and the submarine was rapidly sinking. Every second counted. If the Americans couldn't stem the inflow of seawater, the submarine, alongside her invaluable intelligence, would be lost forever. The sailors sprang into action, using all their strength to cap the open sea strainer and halt the flooding. Their effort bought them precious time, but stabilizing the U-505 remained a challenge. The diesel engines were still running, their vibrations compromising the already weakened submarine. Drawing from their training and knowledge of German U-boat blueprints, the team quickly disconnected the engines from the propellers, easing the strain on the submarine's hull. Back on the American vessels surrounding the submarines, sailors began scouring amongst the prisoners for someone who could help their team stabilize the vessel. Polish-American troops quickly identified a Polish sailor amongst the captured Germans. With time running out, the sailors persuaded the prisoner to assist the boarding party, most likely offering better treatment or rewards in exchange. Once the submarine was stabilized, Lieutenant David's boarding party turned their attention to the intelligence treasure trove hidden within. The sailors moved cautiously, aware of the possibility of traps or hidden dangers left behind by the Germans. Finally, the sailors found their prize. The Enigma machine, still intact, was carefully extracted alongside critical codebooks and charts, preparing them for transfer to the ships. As they emerged from the submarine with their treasures, the boarding party of Task Group 22-3 became the first American sailors to board an active German U-boat and successfully secure it. With the capture of U-505 complete, the Americans now faced a daunting final mission. the last obstacle. Towing a heavily damaged German submarine back to safety was an endeavor without precedent. The U-boat was still partially flooded, and her hull remained compromised, making the risk of sinking during the journey an ever-present threat. The Americans plotted a course to Bermuda, a secure Allied base 1,700 nautical miles away, chosen for its distance from potential German reconnaissance and its suitability for keeping the operation a secret. Destroyer escort USS Pillsbury was the ship tasked with the initial towing attempt. The crew attached a tow line to U-505, and the arduous process of moving the enemy submarine through the Atlantic began. However, shortly after the start of the trip, the damaged rudder of the U-boat caused her to veer out of control, dragging Pillsbury off course and colliding against U-505's hull multiple times, carving a series of cracks under the destroyer's waterline. Recognizing that Pillsbury wouldn't be able to fulfill the mission, Captain Gallery shifted strategies, ordering the flagship USS Guadalcanal to take over. The decision was far from conventional, as escort carriers were not designed for towing operations. But Guadalcanal's size, power, and advanced equipment made her the best candidate for the job. The crew secured a second tow line between the carrier and U-505. As Guadalcanal began her journey, the stabilization efforts of the boarding party paid off. With the submarine's freewheeling propellers rehabilitated, they continued to spin in the water, causing the electric motors to act as generators and recharging the submarine's batteries. Restoring electrical power allowed her to keep her systems partially operational, helping the Americans to maintain some control over U-505 during the rest of the journey. The proof is in the photographs. Now, with all 59 surviving crew members of U-505, including Captain Long, safely aboard the USS Guadalcanal, Gallery decided to pay the German skipper a visit in the carrier's sickbay, where the wounded captain was recovering, unaware of the full extent of what had transpired. Introducing himself, Gallery said plainly, quote, "We have your U-boat in tow." Long blinked, his expression shifting from disbelief to alarm, but ultimately challenging Gallery's claim. To convince him, Gallery showed him his family photographs, once held inside the sub. As the truth finally sank in, Long, speaking in perfect English, sighed and said, quote, "I'll be punished for this." As U-505 and her crew were escorted to Bermuda, destroyer USS Jenks was sent ahead with the Enigma machines and 10 sacks of code books and documents, totaling over 1,100 pounds. But back in Washington, the notoriously temperamental chief of naval operations, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, was livid. Fearing German forces would learn of the capture and immediately change their Enigma codes, King chastised Gallery for risking Allied intelligence and even threatened him with a court-martial. However, the Germans never learned the truth. Gallery ordered absolute silence among the task group, and astonishingly, every crew member complied. As it turned out, timing was also in their favor, as only 2 days after the capture of U-505, the Allies landed in Normandy. This overshadowed any German efforts to investigate, and Berlin officially listed U-505 as sunk. As days went by, the task force remained on high alert, wary of possible German counterattacks as the captured U-505 dragged behind them. Finally, on June 19, 1944, Task Group 22-3 arrived in the safe harbor of Bermuda, turning Gallery into the first captain in the U.S. Navy to successfully capture an enemy vessel for the first time in over 100 years. The captured submarine entered the harbor, flying a large and proud American flag above a smaller German naval ensign on her flagstaff, a powerful symbol of her new status. From risk to reward. After the 59 German prisoners were handed over to the base commandant and placed in an isolated camp to ensure absolute secrecy, the U.S. Navy moved U-505 to the Naval Operating Base at Bermuda, where intelligence officers and engineers pored over every inch of the captured submarine. To keep her capture a secret, the Navy went to extraordinary lengths, repainting her to resemble an American vessel and giving her a new name, USS Nemo. The disguise was critical to maintaining the illusion that U-505 had been sunk, just as the Germans believed. What began as a risky gamble became a triumph. Gallery's bold decision to capture U-505 intact gave Allied codebreakers the tools to decode U-boat signals in real time. This intelligence turned the Kriegsmarine's own tracking systems against them, dealing a critical blow to Admiral Dernitz's submarine fleet in the Battle of the Atlantic. As Admiral Royal E. Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Atlantic Fleet, put it, the work from the task group was, quote, an outstanding performance during anti-submarine operations in the Eastern Atlantic, and, quote, a feat unprecedented in individual and group bravery, execution, and accomplishment in the naval history of the United States. For their work, Lieutenant Albert David received the Medal of Honor for leading the boarding party, the only time that it was awarded to an Atlantic Fleet sailor in World War II. Sadly, he passed away before receiving it. In addition, the entire task group was awarded the prestigious Presidential Unit Citation. Yet no one was celebrated more than Captain Daniel V. Gallery, who became a household name. His bold vision and decisive actions earned him the admiration of both his peers and the nation. Gallery's triumph propelled his career to new heights. He was given command of USS Hancock, one of the Navy's most powerful Essex-class fleet carriers, serving in the Pacific. By the end of the war, the man who dared to think differently had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral. Beyond his wartime achievements, Gallery became one of the Navy's most prolific voices, capturing his experiences and insights in several books. In his most famous work, 20 Million Tons Under the Sea, he recalls the extraordinary tale of the capture of the elusive U-505. Throughout it all, the Admiral took very little credit for the success of the operation, attributing it to thorough planning, adding, quote, maybe our daily morning prayers had something to do with it.